Great. Okay. Um, Thank you for joining us in the afternoon on a Friday for those who are on the East Coast and early in the morning for those on the West Coast. We wanted to have this session for you all, thinking outside the box, mastering indie distribution with Jon Reiss, because we feel like it's an amazing topic. And it's a topic that everyone is talking about right now. So Minorities in Film is a collective for people with disabilities and people of color in film, TV, and theater. We've been around for about 4 years now, creating these amazing workshops and pipeline opportunities for directors and filmmakers to really utilize their communities and get those stories out by any means necessary. So this is completely on brand for us to have one of the leading voices in distribution who brings over 15 years of experience helping filmmakers craft individualized distribution and marketing strategies. I mean, if you know Johnny, know that he has an innovative release with Bomb It to his popular book, Think Outside the Box Office. If you don't have it, I encourage you to go get it. His insights are tailored to each film's unique needs. And so I feel like that's his superpower. And I'm excited for him to be with us on this office hours for this session. My name is Brittany Franklin, the founder of Minorities in Film. Hi, it's nice to meet you all. And I want to just say that as we go throughout the session, Jon is going to have a presentation. There will be moments for a Q&A, but throughout each slide, he's going to pivot over to ask if you guys have questions. You can put them into the chat, or you can raise your hand if you want to come off camera to ask a question yourself. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Jon.
Great. Thanks, Brittany. And thanks for having me. And if people can turn on their cameras, I much prefer talking to people's faces than black screens if possible. But I know sometimes that's difficult if you're on the train or something else. But thank you, Joanna. I appreciate that. So cool. So and good morning, good afternoon to everyone. So I'm just going to run into do a pretty quick presentation, which is essentially an overview of how I approach looking at films and the distribution of films. And it's a structure that I use in working with filmmakers that I find is helpful to them in how to basically strategize the distribution and marketing of their work. So I am going to, hang on a second. Actually, I want to also one thing I do write about this, and I'm starting to do case studies in my Substack that I'm going to, which is currently free and is going to be free. There will always be elements that are free. And I'm just dropping that into the chat. I'm also going to drop my my website into the chat just for now, so that if you want to check out a little bit more about me. Okay, let me share screen. And, oh, yes, hang on. Hang on a second. Do you see a slide that says essentials for crafting a distribution and marketing plan? Or do you see my
Yes.
Substack? Yes, you do see that. Okay, good.
Mhm.
Okay, great. All set. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is, because Brittany said that I should talk about this still, is the broken landscape of distribution and marketing, which is essentially, to be honest, I don't think the landscape is it's maybe broken in different ways and maybe slightly broken worse than it was back in 07, but when I started getting into this, but it's been broken at least since 2007, if not before. And so, but going to just talk a little bit about what we're facing now. And that is essentially there's fewer buyers of content. There's essentially 5 streamers. There's 2 or 3 major distributors. And that's kind of it in terms of buying content. There aren't as many. There used to be more robust platforms. There still is also POV and independent lens, but there just are not as many platforms or distributors as there used to be. Um, Part of the issue is also that monetizing the current paradigm for these platforms is based on subscriber growth and isn't related to any necessarily what the attributes of your particular film. And unfortunately, where they see their subscriber growth coming is from kind of the middle of America, meaning people who are more interested in reality content, true crime, celebrity, which is essentially if they buy content and the content that they create is geared in, especially in the documentary space, is geared towards that. Um, the flip side of this is that we're in a age of abundance. There's anywhere between 50,000 to 100,000 feature films made worldwide. 4 to 5,000 are submitted to Sundance, 80 get into Sundance, just to use Sundance as an example. On a good year, say between Sundance, TIFF, Cannes, Telluride, Berlin, maybe there's 100 to 200 acquisitions, but that's still out of somewhere between even a conservative 20,000 films to 100,000 films. It's a very small percentage of films that are being bought for what would be called an overall or all rights deal, where someone is giving you a chunk of change in exchange for all of your rights, which may not be the thing that you want to do anyway. So one thing that in terms of this, in terms of the age of abundance, the one kind of statistic that I find pretty interesting is that there's 2,500 years of content uploaded to YouTube every month. So you're not only dealing with all the content that exists on the streamers, but there's massive amounts of content being uploaded. Plus, just not to make it any more disturbing or depressing, that it's not even money that is an issue for people anymore. It's time. People have books, people have theater, people have hanging out with friends, people have other things to do with their time than watching movies. So essentially, when you leave this world of the overall deal, which doesn't exist for, again, maybe 100 films a year on a good year, maybe 200 a year, even if it was 500 films a year, which it isn't, that would still be maybe 2% of the films being made. So, which is why I say that this system has been broken for most filmmakers for the last 15 years, because the system, even in the golden age of documentaries, wasn't accommodating all the films that were being made every year. All right. So when you leave that world of the overall deal, you're in this world of split rights, where you are handling the distribution of the film yourself or in partnership with someone, say, like me. You're finding different smaller distributors to handle different rights. And if you don't find a distributor that makes sense for your goals for a certain rights that are available to you, you are doing them yourselves, or maybe those rights are not getting released. But throughout your plan, you're creating relationships, you're doing some of this stuff yourself, you're doing some of it through different forms of distribution entities. And I generally call this hybrid distribution. My fundamental principle is that every film is different and every filmmaker and filmmaking team is different. And as a result, every film and filmmaking team needs a unique distribution and marketing plan that fits that film. And so the rest of this presentation is about how do you create that plan. And one of the things, the post that I did on my Substack yesterday was actually kind of like an outline, will be a little bit very similar to the outline that I'm going to give you, but if you want to refer to it, it's on my Substack, of how I look at films and how I look at creating a distribution and marketing plan for a film. And frankly, on my Substack, probably every week or 2 weeks, I'm going to be writing one of these distribution 101 posts, which will be a deep dive into one area. So 2 weeks ago, I wrote a pretty lengthy piece about how to determine what your distribution goal is and why it's important to pick one distribution goal. So in creating this plan, these are the things that you must consider. One is your goals and how that goal, the goal for your film, relates to the goals of your career. Secondly, looking at your film, not only the brand of your film, but also making sure that the film is as good as it can possibly be. Third, your audience. Fourth, how to reach that audience. Fifth, what film rights make sense for your film, and knowing what those film rights are. Sixth, timing your release. 7, your resources. There's actually an 8th one, which is knowing what stage you're at. But assuming that you're not currently in distribution, that doesn't really necessarily relate to this topic for today. So the 4 goals that I insist on filmmakers picking one of when I work with them or when I'm advising them are money, career, change the world, and audience. And pretty much every goal can fit into that. There's a 5th goal, which is developing a long-term fan base or audience for your work. And that can kind of fit into some of these other goals. And if that is one of your goals, you have to go about creating your distribution in a particular way. So that's something to be considered. But these are the 4 main goals. And the reason I insist on picking one of those is by pursuing one of these paths, you're going to potentially weaken pursuing one of the other paths. So just as the easiest example, if impact and money tend to be diametrically opposed because impact work usually costs a lot of money and often doesn't result in a lot of money. So you often spend money on impact, and often you're giving the film away to create that impact. And you probably, if money was your only goal, you may not be spending money or working towards an impact strategy. And frankly, some of these things are generalizations, and there's exceptions to everything. I'm not going to say that there aren't people who have made a lot of money and done impact. There's probably a couple films there, but it's a much harder way to proceed. And that's why I think it's essential that you pick one goal. And then if you need to pivot while you're in your distribution, you of course should reevaluate what your goal is and how well you're accomplishing it, and then you can pivot. The next thing to consider is your film, and the 2 most important things here is how good is your film? It's a hyper-competitive marketplace, and I won't harp on this, but I find a surprising number of filmmakers who have made their film for an audience, not necessarily that being their goal. There might be one of the other goals, but they've made their film for other people to engage in and do not screen that film for other people before they lock picture and finish their films. So I'm a big advocate of test screenings. The second thing is, what is unique about your film? What is unique about your film in the marketplace? If there are similar films to your film, how is your film different from those other films? Figuring out what the brand of your film is. Yep. Next is, who is your audience? And for me, you need to think about who your niche audience is and who your core, and within each of those niches, what are the core audiences? A lot of people use those terms interchangeably, and I feel like it's a disservice to understanding audience to use those terms interchangeably. So just as an example, um, not that many people are familiar anymore with this concept of the long tail. And there's a couple of different ways to look at the long tail. One is a long tail of revenue, but in this case, I'm using it as a long tail of looking at audience. So here on the y-axis is audience size. Here, actually, I'm in the wrong. I'm using the curve. Here on the y-axis is audience size, and on the x-axis is audiences, the number of different audiences that exist in the world. So over here, you have essentially what the streamers are going after, which are large mass audiences. And this is where reality TV and celebrity and et cetera falls into. So in this long tail, each slice of this audience, this long tail, is what's called the audience vertical. And these are audiences that are arranged around a particular interest. So for instance, we released a film called My Love Affair with Marriage, which was a feminist animated film that dealt with spousal abuse last year. And so one of the niches that we engaged for that film were people who are dealing with spousal abuse. So battered women's shelters, women's groups, et cetera. And part of the reason we had a very successful theatrical release was because we engaged those groups, and we engaged those groups in the cities that we are doing the theatrical release, and we created panel discussions with them, and they did outreach for the screenings. And that's just one example of, a niche audience. But that niche audience might be broader. So just as an example of what a core audience is, so for instance, even though I'm switching from the first step from My Love Affair to the first step is another film that we did we released a couple of years ago, and that dealt with prison reform. And so within the people who are interested in justice for incarcerated persons, there's a core group of organizations around the incarcerated people. And then when you look at the next slide, so that core audience then will spread out into people who are interested in criminal justice issues. So you might have this niche of people who are interested in criminal justice and criminal justice reform in the United States, but where you're trying to do and what you start with is a core audience of those, say, organizations, influencers, et cetera, that talk to that larger audience. So that's why it's important to go after core audiences to speak to a niche audience. It's first important to identify what the niche audiences is, what your niche audiences are. And then once you decide what your niche audiences are, to then try to go after the core audiences within those niche audiences. Are there any questions in the chat so far, Brittany, or?
No, you're good to keep going.
Okay. And so secondary and tertiary audiences are larger and larger audiences within each niche, expanding further and further out. So after you identify your audiences, then you're looking at how do you communicate with your audiences? How did those audiences find out about your film? And so I use this, what's called a piezo model, just as a tool for breaking up, because there's all these different ways of engaging with audience. So as you see here, there's probably 30 different ways of engaging with audiences, which are categorized in each of these paid, earned, shared, or owned media. And I find that it's very helpful for filmmakers to think about it in this way because it helps categorize it, and on limited budgets and with limited time, it just is a way to kind of think about how you're going to market your films. So I'm just going to talk about those very briefly in terms of what each of those mean. So own media is the media that you control completely. So this is your trailer, this is your key art, this is other forms of short form content that you create. It's your email list, it's your website, everything that you completely control. Your film is own media. Any other material that you create out of it is own media. And that can be obviously extremely valuable. Trailers obviously are an extremely effective tool for getting audiences to engage with a film. Websites are also the same. Email lists is very important especially for independent films. So the next category this is in no particular order, although I usually put paid last because paid is probably the most problematic and obviously also the most expensive. But shared media, and the reason I categorize this as shared media is because some people, although maybe not so much anymore, think that social media is that you own your audience on social media. You in no way own your audience on social media. The platform owns your audience on social media, and the platforms determine how you communicate with your audience through social media. So it's an audience that you share with these social media platforms. And it's important to understand that because it's important to understand how you're going to communicate to your audience through what's called organic social. And then the other the two other main categories of shared media are partnerships, as I mentioned earlier, partnerships with organizations or even partnerships with companies. And then a third is influencers. So influencers are becoming increasingly important, not just in fashion and food, et cetera, but they're important in film as well. So there are film influencers out there, people who write about film on social media. They're not traditional press, they just happen to be film influencers. But if you have a film that's in a particular subject area, so say, domestic violence or criminal justice reform, there are influencers, there are people talking about that. And so you want to potentially engage with those. And it's shared because you're sharing your audience, you're sharing their audience and you have to understand how you're going to share their audience with you. So third category is paid media. So that's any form of advertising. So it's social advertising, which is the most common for independent filmmakers because it's the least expensive and used to be the most effective. But it can even involve letterbox advertising, which can be particularly effective for fiction films when you have a Gen Z audience, because there's a lot of fiction film lovers in the Gen Z generation that are on Letterboxd, and maybe a little bit into the millennial, but they really tend to be Gen Z. So if you have a film that really is, you know, that's one of your audiences are of that age, and that's a great place to advertise. And they actually have pretty inexpensive packages for filmmakers. So the last but not least is earned media, which is press. So it's when you do publicity at a film festival or doing publicity for a theatrical release, or you're hiring a publicist for your VOD, that's earned media. But earned media also includes customer reviews, which can be as important as even, well, I wouldn't say as important as the New York Times review, but can be as important as, by having a lot of customer reviews, that can be as important as plenty of other press reviews or traditional press reviews. So it's something that most filmmakers don't think about, but there's ways to cultivate that and to think about cultivating that. Okay, I'm leaving marketing and now moving into film rights. And so what I did when I wrote the book is essentially recategorize film rights. There's like 30 different film rights, but I recategorized them into these 4 categories because it makes it easier, again, for filmmakers to conceptualize how they're going to release their films. So the first is event theatrical, second is digital, third is educational, and the fourth is merchandise. So event theatrical is basically whenever you're screening a film in front of an audience, basically anytime, anywhere, any media. So film festivals, conventional theatrical, alternative theatrical, grassroots community screenings, including virtual and in-person screenings. All of that to me are essentially events or event theatrical. And to me, what unifies them is that this is a live communal experience unavailable anywhere else. And it's the reason why this form of releasing film, this form of film right, is probably one of the most fruitful for independent filmmakers, because what you're doing is creating, it's the way to get audiences to engage when they have so much other content on their platforms, that if you can create a communal experience that people are really wanting these days and make it unique and make it unavailable anywhere else, people will be motivated to come out and see your film. And I've seen that time and time again. But if you just create a theatrical release where it's a week-long run and you're not doing anything special to make it feel like a communal experience, and you're not doing anything to make it unique, then you're essentially just offering something that's similar to what people watch on Netflix, but they have to actually get out of the house, pay more money to it, take time to get down to the theater, and that's part of the reason that theatrical is dying, in my opinion, is because there isn't enough done to make that experience communal and unique. So one of the ways to do this is through time scarcity. And it's why I'm a big fan of one-night bookings. It's why limited releases are doing really well. And it's because it creates FOMO, fear of missing out. If you have the film unlimited, available in an unlimited way, which is what traditional theatrical is, it's very hard to motivate people to get out of the house for that one night. The second way to do this is by creating unique live qualities that are not available. So even filmmaker Q&As, subject Q&As, panel discussions with partners or subjects, live music, food. We're doing a film about Ani DeFranco. We're doing the theatrical release for that. And having her on tour was, it's great to have the director and the producer be there for Q&As, but when Ani DeFranco's there, the fans, the niche audience, the core audience, or the niche audience, Ani DeFranco fans, will show up more when Ani DeFranco's there for obvious reasons. Okay, moving out of events, so digital rights, which for me include all television cable, all forms of VOD, which are transactional VOD, subscription VOD, ad-supported VOD. It also includes airline, hotel, cruise ships. All of this is digital rights. So we have events, we have digital rights, then there's educational rights, which is a blend of events and digital, because the events are in-person screenings at universities or colleges or K through 12 institutions, but also digital rights, where digital rights and also, in a sense, merchandise rights when we get to it in terms of DVDs, but it's mostly done digitally now, where there are digital educational rights that are sold to institutions. So that's educational rights. And then, oh, I left off merchandise, but I think for certain films, merchandise is extraordinarily important. Other films, not so important. So for the Ani DeFranco film, they've actually done quite well creating T-shirts, posters, fanzines, hopefully eventually a vinyl. And they've actually made quite a bit of money doing that. We just did a case study about a film called Hundreds of Beavers yesterday that we did for my Substack, and they have done extraordinarily well selling merchandise. The reason being because they realized that their audience was an audience of collectors, or that's a lot of their audience were collectors. And so they created a lot of collectible merchandise for their audience. But again, doesn't work for all films. So you have to make sure that that makes sense for what your film is, and it has to make sense for what your goal is. So moving on to timing your release, the two main factors for this are what your premiere date is and what the release pattern and windows are. So a release window is the amount of time that one form of film right is permitted to monetize without competition from other film rights. So the classic thing is an exclusive theatrical release window. So commonly filmmakers will have a festival window when they're only in festivals, then a theatrical window, then there might be a community screenings window, then there might be a VOD window, etc. That's the traditional way of looking at it. To me, now you can actually blend, depending on what your strategy is, you can blend a lot of those windows, but you have to do it very carefully. So that's essentially what windows are, release windows are. I think the last thing I'm going to talk about is resources. I've been advocating for 15 years now that filmmakers should budget for distribution and marketing from the conception of their project. It's very difficult for filmmakers to wrap their heads around that and wrap their heads around the need for that, especially because resources are it's tough enough to get a film made, much less think about how you're going to distribute that film. But at least if you conceptualize or know the need of that from inception and start planning for the distribution, making a budget, indicating to your investors or who you're raising your money from that you will be raising money for distribution and marketing, educating them on the need for that, that's all the first step. And some films now are starting to do this, after 15 years, or at least the next step is, if they don't make a sale and their investors have been educated enough in this process that then the investors know at that point in time that it's important for them to chip in more money for the release of the film. So along those lines, it's important to budget for your release and to understand, and that's not just budgeting money, but it's also budgeting time, and understanding that you will be involved in the release of the film. And that even when you were engaged with the distributor, you would want to be involved in the release of the film, because you wouldn't want the distributor to only be in charge of your film, because you spent so much time and energy and effort and creativity in creating your film. You don't want that only to be at the mercy of what the distributor wants it to be. Okay. That's pretty much it. A lot of noise to break through. It's really essential to know what your goals are. It's important to drill down to your audience, and then just understand the different rights and windowing for those rights. And while this is, in a sense, kind of very easy, in practice, it takes a lot of time and effort to figure this out. Okay, so I also, so I have a Substack that I dropped. I work with filmmakers on a consulting basis. I do releases, but I also started a 6-month distribution lab, which there we go. And I'm going to be doing an info session about it next week. And so if any of you want to join, I can drop a link into the chat. But essentially, it's a 6-month program where you work in a cohort of other filmmakers, up to 10 films. The last two, we've had 9 in each of the last cohorts. There's a lot of presentations. Some of them I do live, some of them are on video. I bring in visiting experts to talk about various topics, but then we also spend time, a fair amount of time, workshopping your particular film one-on-one with me, but also workshopping it with the other filmmakers that are in the cohort. And a lot of filmmakers feel like one of the biggest benefits of being in the lab is that you're going through this process with other people and that you're not just alone. So, all right.
I love that. Thank you for this. And it's been 30 minutes, 31 minutes. So it's very concise,
Yes.
straightforward presentation. And we love that. So now is the fun part of the office hours, which is really like getting informal and making the connections that you would have to make offline, online. And this is your great opportunity to ask your questions, introduce yourself to Jon as well, because the lab that's upcoming is a really exciting resource that I know, Jon, like you have a lot of great filmmakers applying and attending for that. Just before we get into the questions, is the lab limited to a certain amount of folks? Is it competitive or it's first come, first serve?
It's so it's not as competitive as if film independent, something like that.
Mhm.
And it's not all, but it's not first come first serve as well. So it's a maximum of 10 films, but it's not, and so it's not one person from the film, it's up to 3 people. You can have a film team participate in the lab. So, but it does cost money, so that's also another factor. At some point, I do want to get it funded, but currently I'm not a nonprofit, so I don't get funding for this. So that's the only downside to it. But I also work with filmmakers one-on-one, etc. So, and I'm also putting out a lot in the Substack, but you know,
Yeah. It's definitely worth the investment, everyone. So again, there's 3 resources he just offered to you. Substack, free, one-on-one, a little bit more economical. And then we have the distribution lab, which is for you and your team to really learn and grow together in a 6-month intensive. And I find that that's very important when you have a project and it needs to get out there like ASAP. So if you're working with the team, y'all want to learn together, learn fast. I highly recommend the lab. So we do have a question and introduce yourselves. I'm gonna allow you all to come off mute, but I'm gonna go down the queue. Robert Lopez. Hi, Robert. Do you want to ask your question or do you want me to just reiterate what you put in the chat? Up to you. Okay. Robert says, I'm actually at work right now, so thank you. He wrote and directed a feature film, and the story deals with how brothers use their vivid imagination to cope with trauma after losing their father. I submitted it for Sundance, still waiting. Cross fingers, Robert. But I have no clear path of best results for marketing and distribution at all. Any guidance is appreciated.
yeah, so I wouldn't only submit to Sundance, like just in terms of festivals. And I'm going to do an AMA for my Substack, and probably one of the first ones will be about festivals. But just, I always recommend if it's fine to submit to A-list festivals, but to also submit to niche festivals and to regional festivals. And because all the A-list festivals are hyper competitive, you don't know, they might have programmed your film even last year, but this year, partially because they programmed the film similar last year, they're not going to look for that film this year. You could have the best film in the world and still not get in, because programming staffs have their own criteria. So that's why it's good to have a strategy that isn't dependent on only A-list festivals, and you can create quite a strategy with a variety of niche and regional festivals. And you can sometimes do much better doing that than to put everything into an A-list festival. Because to do Sundance, like it's one thing to get into Sundance. Once you're in Sundance, it can cost $50,000 to $60,000 to have a film in Sundance. Because you generally hire a publicist, you have to travel everyone there. It's very expensive there, etc. And a lot of films can do a release for $50,000 to $60,000. So, it depends again, kind of figuring out what your strategy is and what your goal is. And so applying to Sundance might help with a sale, possibly, so hence money. It also helps with your career. But for instance, if your goal is impact, it may not be the best route. Although I'd never tell anyone that if you're accepted to Sundance to turn it down, because it is beneficial in many ways. But that's why it's important to create a strategy not just for the entire release of your film, but for every aspect of it. And so for me, creating a festival strategy is only one part of your strategy, and it has to fit into what your overall goal is. And to think about, okay, so I'm going to do festivals. What makes sense? What is my goal? What makes sense for what I'm trying to do after that to accomplish that goal? So, I mean, if you want to come off, Robert, and if we have time, but I don't know how much, if we can come back to this, I'd be curious in asking what your goal is and like in a sense how you're planning on getting there and that's why you can't answer any one particular you can't answer any one thing about a release without knowing first what the goal is. And then how that aspect of the release fits into everything else that you're doing.
Right. I think that's very on point too, because with all of you and all of your projects is a lot of filmmakers start and they do festivals and they say, I genuinely don't know what my goal is, which is why I don't know what the path is. So I guess the homework is to figure out what that goal is for this film, short, series, whatever it is. It's the goal to sell it, it's the goal to reach people who also experience grief and trauma after losing a father. Is a goal to like start this impact campaign around that. So once you have that, people like Jon and would be able to really give you a better, more bespoke guidance for your project. So
That's but it is one of the things I help people do is figure out what their goal is and also to make sure that the whole team is aligned on the one goal. And it's hard. Like a lot of filmmakers try. The first thing filmmakers will say, well, why can't I have all four? So nearly every filmmaker has said that. Like there's very few filmmakers who've said, why can't I have money, career? Why can't I change the world? And why can't I have a huge audience? And don't those all go together? And
mhm,
yes, for 5 films a year, they do all go together. But there's only 5 films a year that happens with, or somewhere 1 to 10 films a year, and there's 40,000 other films out there. So
yeah, yeah, good point. Next we have Pia. I see you're on, so I would love to say hi and have you ask your question. You're
you're on mute.
muted.
You're muted.
Um, I produced in the no budget, low budget horror space, lots of
Mhm.
booze, blood, um,
Mhm.
self-funded.
Right,
We get on Amazon,
right.
but I'd like to maybe try some shifting. There's a lot of conversation in genre filmmaking about merchandising,
Mhm.
and there are some things obviously that lend themselves to that, right? Storyboards into stickers, BTS into, pins, that kind of thing. But collectibles, I
Mhm.
I looked at that type of merchandising and it seems prohibitively expensive. Like, oh my God,
Mhm.
like fabricating, right? It's like, oh my. Are there, would you be a person that we could hire if we did? I mean, is that something that you do? Is say, like, okay, for what this is and how much you spent for the film's potential, or, is merchandising worth it for the product that we have?
I probably wouldn't do something where it's strictly about it's merchandise, but it'd be a matter of like if it was part of an overall plan,
Mark,
and there's things that you can do to kind of test that a little bit. And you can start off smaller, and see what the appetite is for certain things. And it was interesting, Hundreds of Beavers just started off with posters and, and just saw whether there was a desire to collect in a sense. And, before they, created anything fancier, like raccoon hats, for instance. But there's like a lot of, t-shirts aren't that expensive these days. Like shipping is more, I mean, with t-shirts, it's more about the shipping. And there's lots of like enamel pins are pretty cheap. Like I've just been
Pins
around the pins
are
are pretty,
affordable like that.
yes.
But again,
Yeah,
it's like original art, or because again, that's a conversation in the low, no budget space. Art is very expensive,
right.
right? And so, we can have our poster, but then again, is that something that it's okay to replicate and to sell? And so again,
Yeah.
a marketing plan, you would do something more
Well, if you do, yeah. I mean, it's a matter of like what makes sense. If you're making posters already, you usually have to do 100 minimum and maybe use 30 of them. And so you've got 50 left over and you sign and number those and sell those. It's the signing and the numbering that makes it more valuable, for instance, for collectors.
And now that you say that, I have a friend who wrote one of the Saw films, and that's exactly what they did. So,
Right. And you can
yeah.
and you can also, I mean, Blu-rays and Blu-rays are very big in the horror space, and
Yeah.
they're big in lots of different spaces, and and that's a form of merchandise, and people buy them partially because they're never going to even open that box, but they're having it because it represents their enjoyment of the film, and it's a memento in a
Oh,
sense. And
oh,
Blu-rays can be pretty cheap these days, to be honest, to produce.
thank you very, yeah, because again, but my head goes to what some of the bigger films do, which is, uh, little characters and again, unique art, special art,
Well,
commissioned for
that's
this
getting a
project.
little, that's where it starts getting a little expensive. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I would start small. Yeah.
That was a great question, especially in the horror genre space where a lot of people want to collect things that happen within the story, within the slashers. They want the t-shirt, they want the caption phrase, they want the little knife tokens. Like it is
Yeah.
a big, it's a big thing and ask for that audience. So I do print or something that's like the easiest thing to do. My mom was an art collector and she really looks at how many numbers are printed. She
Yes.
goes to like, the auctioners and looks at like, is this signed on the back? Like these are little details that make it more, for those collectors, like, oh, this is limited. I might not get
Yeah.
this anywhere else.
Yeah. Yeah. If you want to see someone who really does this well, he's not in the horror space, but there's a filmmaker named Gary Hustwit, Hustwit. He's the one who just made the Eno film, but he's done really incredible merchandise for a lot of his films, and a lot of his films deal with the design and architecture audience who are very collectible oriented. And I still remember he sold a hard drive with the film sealed, and I can guarantee you, no one who bought those sealed hard drives opened up those seals, that they just bought the object for the object. Anyway,
And then you said that name was Gary Hustwit.
yeah, Gary Hustwit. So I could drop his website in the chat and you'll see he also makes books. But maybe for your horror, probably looking at the Hundreds of Beavers merchandise, that would probably be a little more appropriate.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And good luck. Good luck. We have another question about your distribution lab from is it Shanalina Palmer? Do you want to ask your question? Hi.
Good morning. So I have two questions actually. For the distribution lab, I was wondering where in the process of post-production do you need to be to join the lab? And then the second question is, you've mentioned you and your teams do. I'm like a team of one. So I'm wondering who else I should buff my team up with, in thinking about going into post-production now. Well, not post-production, but into the distribution marketing phase.
Yeah, the best place is kind of like rough cut to fine cut, because I also, um, do a lot of consulting as a consulting producer and will give feedback on the film. Lock picture, we've had people who are already in the festival world, and that's also fine. But if you're just still getting to a rough cut, that can be a little bit like I've had some people in the lab and they've gotten a lot out of the lab, but then it's better when they're like right on the verge of, getting ready. Like, well, to be honest, one person in the current lab is, I told them that their film's not ready yet and gave them a lot of critiques of their film. And I said, you should be doing part of what we do in the lab is also talk about how to do audience screenings, preview screenings, and they actually went out and did it, and then they fired their editor and recut their film, and now they're much happier with it. But they're not as far as long as they thought they were going to be, for instance. So somewhere in the rough cut to fine cut stage. And then, so what was you had a second question. What was the second part?
Second part is about teams. Like
Oh, right. So it depends. Yeah, so it all depends on what your goal is and what kind of release you've determined for that goal. So for instance, if you're a very impact-oriented project, I would think that an impact producer would be someone that you would bring on. The various types of team people, a lot of times filmmakers do their own impact, but it's very labor intensive, and you should at least have someone advising you on it. Um, you know, if you're at a premiere festival and or doing a theatrical release, a publicist is pretty important. Sometimes people bring on social people to do social media, or they handle their own social media. Um, I'm just trying to, those are the kind of the main, people. Sometimes people who are doing that themselves, the first person they bring on is an assistant. And so I've had a number of people in the lab who hire assistants and have the assistants go through the lab so that the assistants are kind of learning how to do this work, so that they can support the person doing the work. So,
Gotcha. So if you are like the film that I did is under $100,000, and I know you mentioned a number of 50,000 for marketing. How much should I realistically be looking towards having for the marketing budget, marketing and distribution?
you know, it's
Does
I it's I usually feel like most release it depends on how you're going to release the film. I mean, it's hard to say because I don't know what your goals are, don't know the film, but it's hard to do releases for less than 30, unless you're doing it's all sweat equity. So meaning you doing it everything yourself or finding people to also do it with you. There's just certain, hard costs that usually end up spending. I use the example of my film Vomit, where I made a release budget for, I think, 50,000, gave it to the investor, and he said, okay, I'll give you 13,000. And so I said, okay, I'll take it. And so I started with 13,000 and then used the money from the release to fund the rest of the release, which he was fine with. And it ended up, I spent $60,000 on the release. So you can start smaller and have some seed money, but so long as you think it's realistic that if you're going to count on money from the release coming in to help support it, it's important to know that that's probably going to happen. And so if, for instance, one of the films I've worked on recently, their goal was audience and impact. And so they were not charging for the film because they wanted more people to see it. So in the first 2 months of the release where we gave the film away for free, we did 120 screenings in 28 countries. And then we started charging for it. And then a year later, we've added 2 countries, and we've probably done, in another year, we've done 80 screenings versus 120 screenings in 2 months, to just give you a sense of like trade-offs between attendance and money, but by the same token, they also wanted to start charging money because they need to fund the release of the film.
Right.
So,
Thank
sure.
Yeah. And also like a good hack or a tip for this is to also consider brands, you know, especially if you guys are looking to find that investment into your distribution release. One thing that we found works really well, a lot of our filmmakers do crowdfunding, and that's considered the seed money for them to go out and do what they need to do. But we always encourage them to have in the pie in the sky budget. What does it look like if you could distribute and market in the way that you would see fit, like how based
Yeah.
on the goals for your story? And it's really exciting because if a lot of brands are getting into long form, a lot of brands will have this thing where you know your community very closely and they want to find that brand affinity. So if you have a brand that is organically baked into your story already, try pitching them and putting out a budget to say, hey, this story heavily resonates with your brand's mission. I really want you guys to be a part of this. We can do an in-app integration if it's a software or there's a product market fit here. Can we get like 6,000 or 10K? And you use that to allocate funds to distribution, but you can also give them some content going back to what Jon said in the beginning, like that, is it earned media or shared media? Where we give you content, you can use that on your platforms or whatever.
Right.
So think about innovative ways to get that money in. It's not always coming out of your pocket. Should it always come out of your
Right.
pocket?
Yeah. It's preferable if it's not, obviously. So yeah.
Yes. And I know a lot of you, I saw Winces is like, oh, I know you're taking a lot of your personal money, your tax refunds, all of
Yeah.
these things to finance that. So like really think about other ways to get other people's money and have fun with other people's money.
Yeah.
I think P had another question. Go ahead, ask.
I just wanted to know, I've got some folks pitching a science fiction comedy at me. And
Mhm.
that's not anything I've ever done. Boobs and Blood is pretty established. You know, you get an awesome YouTuber who has a following, and here we go. So that whole thing makes me nervous.
Mhm.
What is the earliest stage of a project that you do consulting? Like, is this a niche thing, or is it so like off that it doesn't really have a significant, niche audience? Obviously, there's an audience for, anything at a point in time. But is there a niche enough audience, significant enough audience for us to find it and capitalize on it? I mean, again, it's easy
Right.
to when the boobs and blood, but science fiction, comedy, that's
Yeah, I mean, I do sometimes come on at the script stage, but mostly I'm kind of coming on at the rough cut, to, somewhere in the rough cut, fine cut stage. So, and most of the script consulting I'll do is unless they want, a lot of, and sometimes I don't even necessarily need to read the script, but just, thinking about, what pre-conceptualizing what an audience for this could look like.
Mhm. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So again, like in the boobs and blood space, it's baked in. There we go. And I don't have to think about that. And there's already so many other moving parts. It makes me very nervous. But yeah, that
Yeah.
that
Well, if it makes you nervous, go with your gut, but maybe this isn't the right sci-fi project, and maybe
yeah,
there's another one that will come along.
money and not my own.
Yes.
I love that. All right, we have a few more minutes left. I would really encourage you all to ask your questions now. This is a really great opportunity to meet Jon, have him see you, see your face. Like we said in the beginning, it's easier talking to real people than little boxes on a screen. So hop off mute if you have a question or just let me know. If not, I would love to know where everybody's from, where you're journeying from today. And if there's a project that you guys are currently working on, which is what excited you to be a part of this office hour in the first place, we can just close out with that discussion. Anybody want to go? You can raise your hand, use the hand raise feature, or drop it in the chat.
No, no questions about distribution and marketing at all?
At all. I see Robert. Thank you joining from LA. Thank you all. I see Robert's back. So Robert, in your initial question, you were talking about guidance, and you have no clear view of where that looks like for distribution and marketing. Jon said he will happy circle back on this regarding your goals. So do you
Oh,
have a goal for, yeah, go ahead, Robert.
Roberts, you're muted if you're.
Or if not,
Or
you
not.
can or not, you can like put it in the chat with the time that we have now or connect with Jon afterwards. I feel like this conversation is something that's always in the back of our minds and happening in the background, but it's also the last thing that filmmakers think about because they're trying to like get through the fire and survive all of the burning buildings that are happening just to get the film made. So, what is some tips that you would leave with our audience here? Like, what should they think about, even in the midst of the chaos of the story? What should they keep most in mind?
That, and it's not something that filmmakers like to keep in mind, but that they will need to create a distribution and marketing plan for their film, that they're responsible for engaging their film with an audience, and to start thinking about, how that's going to happen. And just basically with those points that I laid out, like, what are they trying to accomplish? What do they want to accomplish with the film? Like, how does that relate to their career? What's unique about their film, which is something that they should kind of be thinking about from the beginning, in a sense. I actually think that filmmakers should think about this at the beginning of all their projects, not to say that if they have something they're super creative about, or that they have a super burning creative need to make a film, but to think about, like, how is that different, and how are you going to engage audiences, and who the audience is, how you're going to engage those audiences, and what makes sense, even just starting with that, I would say, even outside of thinking about like the various film rights, but thinking about what the goal is, thinking about who your audience is, thinking about what is unique about your film, and then really planning that, planning for distribution and marketing, for your film. So, and understand that it's going to be part of the process.
Yeah, and I see I had some DM questions about this as well, and Jon just answered it. Yeah, you should think about the goal ahead of time.
Yeah.
Once your script is done, once you have that treatment, start working backwards. Isn't just working backwards from release and finish. It's working backwards from the audience. So when it's out in the world. So whenever you're working with your producer, you should start thinking about like the type of people you want to reach. Where are they, and how would you like to package this nicely for them to experience this story? So for a lot of people that came in after the presentation, good news, this is recorded, and we are going to be able to host it for you all by Monday so that you can go and watch back. This is a free session, so it will be available on YouTube for you all for free. I would like to go back and plug in those resources that Jon provided. He has a Substack. He has a lab coming up for submissions. He also has one-on-one consultations that he's offering to folks who just, don't have a full team, but they want to get the head voting to lead their project.
Yeah.
And
And I just started doing, because my normal consultation is 3 hours and it's a little expensive, but Doc NYC asked me to do these shorter consultations. So I've actually started doing just half-hour consultations and hour consultations. Let me just actually pull that up and drop that in, if that might be of interest to anyone. Let's see. hang on a second. I just got to find the link because it just started. I just started doing this. So I think this is, yeah, here's that link. It's new enough that it's not even on I haven't even put this link on my website yet. So,
Right.
yeah. Cool.
So this is the link in the chat. I want to give you guys time to copy that over before
Yeah.
we wrap out the session. It's all right, Robert, for the bad connection. Yeah, we've all been again, thank you all for joining us today.
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure to hear you and hear about your stories, Jon. Thank you again for taking out the time to connect with us. Oh, here's Tommy. Do we have time for one more question? Jon, are you good?
Yeah, yeah, sure.
Okay, so Tommy says, my two finished screenplays are about homeless people. One former homeless man whose works outreach helping homeless, and the other one, the story is about homeless people attacked as a hate crime. Who would I be looking at to spark interest in this subject matter moment? Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, potentially, organizations that work with homeless people, but I don't know how much. I mean, that's where some of the audience for this is going to be. But, thinking about like, and this could, it takes a while to make a film, but like I know people are looking for more hopeful content these days. So maybe the first story. And one of the things that P is doing that's kind of interesting is that when you're casting, to not just think about, regular actors, that there's a lot of people, influencers, that are on YouTube, that are on Instagram. There's a filmmaker, Sean Baker, who has been doing this for years, casting off of social media. And very effectively, you might want to take a look at the Florida project, and the lead actress he cast her from Instagram. And she didn't have a ton of followers there, but it is something to think about, but also to think about who your audience is and what would be attractive to that audience, and who, that might be interesting. But I would think about possibly talking to groups that work with homeless and seeing if they might be interested in becoming partners early on in the process, and being engaged, because there's a lot of documentaries about homeless people, but there haven't been that many fiction films. And it might be another way for them to help communicate with what's going on to audiences and broaden the understanding of homelessness.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. So Tommy, I hope you heard that, and go and look into those resources that Jon provided. And also, if you want to connect with him later, Substack, one-on-ones, and also he has a distribution lab coming up. I do want to start wrapping out and saying thank you again. Minorities in Film, we host these office hours every month. So make sure that you follow us on our newsletter on Instagram at Minorities in Film. And you can send us an email of what you would like to hear next if you want Jon to come back. Are there other speakers you want to hear from? Again, we're a collective for people of color and people with disabilities, and we offer resources to help them get their stories told through these type of workshops and our partner programming with agencies and grants. So I'm excited to host this with you guys, and I'm looking forward to seeing you next month. With that being said, have a great weekend. I appreciate you all for showing up, and see
Thanks,
you soon.
everyone. Have a great weekend. Thanks, Brittany. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.